My name is Mary Biddle Koenig. I am the Assistant Director of the Smith Enterprise Risk Consortium, or CERC as we call it, at the Robert H. Smith School of Business at the University of Maryland. I'd like to welcome you to our September webinar and our Risk Leadership Series, which is brought to you by CERC, ZRG Partners, and the Office of Executive Education at the Smith School of Business. Our webinars are focused on top-of-mind risks that vary from month to month. We've covered everything from issues and challenges in cyber insurance markets to the Basel III Endgame to responsible AI, just to name a few of the topics that we had over the last year. Today, we are very excited to be having a conversation about third-party risks. One of the underlying premises of CERC is that many risks are industry agnostic, and our discussion today goes right to the heart of this issue. I'm thrilled to introduce our moderator and our speaker today. Laura Larea is our moderator. Laura is not only the Chief Legal and Enterprise Risk Officer at the Money Store, but she's also one of our CERC Advisory Council members. As a veteran of the mortgage industry, she has decades of experience navigating the legal and compliance world of risk management. And Vanessa Pegueros has an extensive background in technology and cybersecurity and currently serves on several boards of directors, including being the chair of the risk committee for the BECU. With expertise that unifies corporate governance, technology, and cybersecurity, Vanessa offers a wealth of experience in the complexities of technology projects in both favorable and challenging economic environments. With that, Laura, I will turn it over to you to start the discussion.
Thank you, Mary Biddle. We're very excited to be here, and I appreciate the time. And I'm excited to be here with Vanessa on this Friday. So I just want to kick it off with a general statement that we are not going to discuss COVID and CrowdStrike in particular. We're just using those as examples of business interruption or outages to continue our conversation about third-party risks and that we face. Some we know, some we don't, and we really wanted to focus on how we as risk managers try to instead of react, be a little more proactive, or maybe not a little more, but a lot more proactive as different outages and business interruptions kind of cross our paths. So hopefully that kind of lays out the beginning part of this conversation. So Vanessa, as we were prepping for this and talking about various third-party risks, I think in my role as Chief Risk Officer and Legal Officer, I think there's a lot of things that kind of cross my desk, and I struggle with, advising and providing advice and understanding and getting my executive team to a point where I am explaining and providing the various pieces of information so that they can make informed decisions and address these things. So as we look at a CrowdStrike or a COVID situation with the outages that occur, what would you suggest with your experience in both like the CISO aspect and other sitting on boards now? What do you think some of our key pieces of information that we should be looking for as chief risk officers or looking at to help our companies anticipate these and maybe avoid some of the underlying aspects of the interruption that occur?
Yeah, thank you, Laura. What you just asked is pretty
mouthful. I'm sorry. It is.
No, it's just there are so many elements of this. And like what I would like to start with is the acknowledgement and acceptance of the world we're in. Is change is accelerating. The complexity is increasing. We as human beings are living in very challenging times with the pace of change and complexity. And this is reflected, I think, in our organizations as well. So what I would say is, like, I'm going to start at the highest level, which is we have to think about our environments differently. And I think we have a tendency as humans to want to have things become stable and to have things predictable. And but we don't have that type of reality anymore in with everything. I think that we as need to change our mindsets in business, and we need to start looking more specifically at systemic risk and really starting to understand how our enterprise, how our business is connected to so many other things, obviously third parties are our main topic, but like all the different dependencies we have in our organizations, and understanding the risks of those, which are completely, in many cases, unknown, even though we want to act like they are known. We put these processes in place that essentially are not really effective at assessing the risk to anything more than a very surface level, because of the uncertainty in everything. So I don't mean to sound like this is a lost cause, but I need us to think that we will be a victim. We will become susceptible to things that we didn't expect, that we weren't prepared for. But I think that's where we have to start to change our mindset and think differently. We need to anticipate that there will be something that happens, that there will be a situation we didn't think would occur. So it's almost I came up with, instead of being reactive, and I know this isn't a word, but be forecastive. We have to think more about what could happen. So and that just kind of has so many different you know, like different paths we can take in how we approach the business. And so, but it is a cultural thing I think we need to build into our organizations now, that we will not be able to predict everything that happens. So what process and the structures we put in place to allow us to be better when these things we did not forecast happen. So
Right. So I think it's interesting as you talk about what can we put in place to be how did you say, forecasted?
yeah,
And I like that.
forecasted. I
I
know
like
it's not
that.
a word. I know it's
No,
not
I
a
like
word.
it. It's good because so if as you were saying that, I'm thinking back, like, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago. I was only 3 at that time. I'm kidding. But and maybe it was even earlier than that, but having those conversations with the lines of business and in the IT area about business continuity and doing the testing for um, business interruption, and getting folks, like, I remember kind of the interaction of being, well, why do we have to do that? Why would we need that? And it's really getting folks in the lines of business to the place that, again, even at that point, it was anticipating the what hadn't happened or the unexpected, and forecasting to that. So to some degree, we've been doing that for a while, but I don't know that we've been doing it. Like, I guess I would ask you, what are some thoughts on how we could improve um, working with our various within our own company or our own lines of business, but also then working with the third parties to whom we're interconnected, as you mentioned, to help all of us anticipate what
I think
hasn't occurred yet.
Yeah, I think if we were able to get each system owner or third-party vendor owner, like within our environments, to ask the question, what would we do if this vendor was breached? What could be the impact to us? And or what would we do if the system went down, and what would be the impact for us? And I think it's first understanding how changes in these with these different players or stakeholders would impact the business. Do you have a backup plan if that particular system went down? And in some cases, like let's talk about like with what happened with CrowdStrike as an example. What happened, and then the impact to Microsoft. So there are these big things that we just know, like we're not going to be able to recover very quickly. If AWS went down completely, how many businesses would be, just pretty much paralyzed by that? They might have a secondary cloud provider, but there are these big, almost like too big to fail kind of systems out there now that if they go down, they bring down a lot of other things. And most businesses have no control of that unless they were to say, I'm going to architect a completely redundant like environment on Azure so that if AWS goes down, I can flip over to Azure, and that's not cost effective, So
Exactly.
like there are realizing the things that you really can't do much about, like AWS, the big, and in case of Microsoft, if Microsoft systems fail to operate through some kind of CrowdStrike type incident, most businesses, like, we can't control that. We can't, like, those are scenarios like we don't think they could happen. They do happen. COVID, another one. We didn't anticipate that was going to happen. It did happen. So I think what we need to do is talk a little bit more about things that we don't think are ever going to happen, and assume that they happen and play through that. And what will we do? And again, that goes to a mindset of constant change and like things we're not going to be able to predict. So I think having those conversations, but in the more day-to-day stuff that we do, I think no, a lot of organizations don't really have an effective disaster recovery plan.
Right.
It's become a compliance thing. So like they've never truly tested it. They don't have it I mean, they've done tests enough to pass compliance, but they don't actually know. Have you actually literally turned that system down like in the middle of the day when when it's like the busiest time, and seeing what happens, and see and test that it works? Now, I'm not saying no company does that, but I think far more don't do it in that way because they're trying to minimize the risk that they would impact their customers or their
Right.
members in the case of a credit union. So we are just very we kind of do it enough for compliance, but we don't fully test many of these systems so that when the bad thing happens, we truly know what the impact's going to be.
Right. No, I think you've hit the nail on the head for a lot of companies, and for us as risk officers or compliance officers to really take back to our teams and say, in light of the CrowdStrike event or in light of COVID, let's push the boundary and not just do a tabletop exercise that, to your point, checks the box from a compliance perspective. And it is interesting. I kind of chuckled when you were talking about it's become a compliance piece. That has been because I kind of came up through in the financial institution world, the regulatory compliance side, doing research and understanding regs and statutes and how they interact, and then getting that data onto particular forms. And so I worked with the IT team. And so a lot of times I am in a position of, hey, Laura, I work with the IT team, or even the IT team saying compliance owns the disaster recovery. Like everyone wants to look at someone else for the ownership of disaster recovery. And
Yeah.
really, I guess maybe as chief risk officers, as I'm listening to you, I need to take back that we need to frame it that all of us own parts of that, but we need to your point, really have have a real business interruption and see what is going to work and where do we need to improve versus
You have to take the risk to test your resiliency to the risk.
yeah.
I think businesses, rightfully so, are risk averse when it comes to impacts to their customers or members, and I understand that.
Right.
But are we doing a disservice to our customers because we're not really truly understanding the impact? So I
What-
think, and then the other I would just bring up again, pointing to like the kind of the CrowdStrike incident. It's like we tend to focus on the thing that happened, and then we decide, oh, I'm gonna go run and ask the board does this, executives do this. I'm gonna go ask my head of IT or whoever, head of security, like, do we have that issue? Like, could this impact us? But like, we kind of artificially bound our question, because like, instead of asking, okay, this happened to us, we get it, you're working on it, you're on top of it, you're gonna resolve it. And I also want to know, like, let's talk about other really big things that we're susceptible. Like, let's have a conversation about, these these possibilities and how we would respond to them. So let's be comprehensive and like and curious about what are the other things that could come back and really impact us significantly. Some of them are really simple, like I mentioned before, AWS goes down.
Right,
Like, the entire environment's on AWS. Okay, our entire company's down. Okay, so what do we do then?
right.
Okay, our entire company's down. How do we handle communications? How do we deal with our customer base? What is our plan once AWS comes back? Because they will come back at some point. How will that impact when they come back? Will that impact any of our systems down the line that were connected in some way? Now we have other, trailing impacts that we have to deal with. So like, understanding, even though we have no control if that happened, that AWS went, understanding what we do control and what would be the other impacts is really important.
I like that too, defining what can we control in that swirl of uncontrollability. I also think I was thinking while you were speaking just now about several years ago there was an incident where and I don't remember the name of the company, but where the patch somebody didn't go back and patch something they weren't doing the immediate when a patch comes out, somebody wasn't controlling that. And so again, I think at that point everybody was like, are we doing immediate patches, and only asking that question versus looking more broadly. So again,
All right, let's talk about our patch process. Let's
correct.
talk about a lot of times when things happen, you do a root cause analysis, and the root cause analysis stops at, oh, we didn't do that patch.
Mhm.
Well, actually, that's not the root cause. That is
Right.
the first why that didn't happen. But why didn't you do that patch?
Yeah.
Like, go a few levels deeper. Like, well, I didn't do that patch because, I had this other priority
Mhm.
and I didn't have time to do it. And we're under resourced and I can't do three things at the same time. So I prioritized and I did these other two things before I did the patch. Or I didn't even know about the patch because nobody told me that I needed to do it, which is a breakdown in communications internally. Or, nobody, here's another one. Yeah, I didn't really nobody really owns that system that we're aware of. So like, the patch went missing, but like, that's an ownership and inventory problem within the business. So like, going a level deeper than just it was a patch. Yeah, of course it was a patch, but like, that's not the root cause. So you have to really, again, dig deeper and get to that root cause.
And as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking those are almost, people are so stressed in the event, right? And the aftermath, and trying to answer questions quickly. And we're even driven to that. And again, this varies somewhat by industry, but I do think it's more globally too now. People want answers quickly. Data breaches within 12 hours, we must notify uh, regulators or different bodies. And that almost drives some of this quick, give me an answer as to what happened, and then you're moving to solve and not really digging deeper as you suggest. And I think we, again, as me as a chief risk officer, I need to really kind of, while we need to address things timely and get answers, we also have to provide to our lines of business some of that continuity of questions to say, okay, we dealt with this now. Let's take a phase 2, a phase 3, and start asking some of those deeper questions so that we can avoid the whack-a-mole, as we were talking about in planning this conversation, because it does feel like whack-a-mole to each of these events, right? And that gets numbing too, because at least in my role, sometimes I think it feels like I'm just out there trying to get and be reactionary. So
Yep.
this is very helpful, I think.
As a leader, you know, a board or executive like yourself, you have to go deeper. I mean, because the people on the front line, they are kind of playing whack-a-mole. They've got so much stuff coming at them, and they're just doing the best they can, and they need somebody to ask the bigger questions.
Mhm.
And if the executives aren't asking the bigger questions, they're not going to be addressed, and you're going to continually be in this loop of you know, you're gonna have another patch issue a month down the road. You're gonna have another, you know, it's just not gonna end because you're not solving the core, you're not solving the core problem. And I think more than ever, we have with AI coming on, we have the ability to, and I know it's early, but we have the ability to automate more in our environments. We have the ability to analyze data a lot quicker. I mean, it's not completely there, but it is gonna be there very quickly. And so this will allow us to make more, I think, comprehensive decision making and more and understanding more fully the root cause of things in a quicker way. And you're right, everybody wants the answer when the crisis happens.
Mhm.
But it's up to the leadership to be, you know, level-headed and say, okay, we know that it was caused by a patch. Let's go get that fixed. And we need to have a meeting after that's completed, and we need to dive into the, you know, more details around why this happened. And typically, once an issue, I've seen this over and over in my career, once the immediate issue is resolved, everybody wants to move on. They
Yep.
don't want to talk about like what happened. They want to go, because it's kind of not, it's a very stressful thing. So people tend to want to like distance themselves from it as quickly as they can. But that's not fixing the problem. And then you are putting like you said, you just keep your whack-a-moling in our example, the patches, you're just going to have more issues and more issues. So, so I really believe leadership has to have the discipline of asking more and not settling for the answer that is incomplete and doesn't help.
Right. I also was thinking too, like different economic aspects hit different industries, and I think it goes a lot to what you said, in terms of, as our example, why didn't the patching happen? And particularly in a case where legal and compliance, risk management, we're cost centers, right? And so again, as leaders, making sure that we can articulate our need for representation or enough bodies to take care of and help understand the risks impacting the lines of business in the company, but also, you know, helping to solution too. How can we change? You know, how can we maybe alter the guardrails that then help improve the business, but limit or lessen some of the risk out there, right? I think, but it's being able to articulate that we may need to add staff in a certain area to cover that more underlying.
Yeah.
So there may be an outlying cost, right?
Mhm.
But being able to really articulate that in handling that and addressing that cost outset, that you're helping the business curb the risk and potentially be able to move faster and quicker and be more nimble and improve the business ultimately, right? That's
This is another leadership and board kind of related situation. Like the people at the level that are fixing these issues and their managers don't have, I mean, they can ask for more resources, but as we all know, they might not get them.
Yep.
And they try and explain why they, why they need them. They come up with all the rationale around it, and still, if the business is in a larger financial stress situation, they're probably not going to get the resources. The challenge is that the leadership and board then needs to recognize that what they're doing is accepting risk, and they're accepting that these bad things are going to continue to happen, maybe something even worse. And so it goes to risk tolerance. And as a risk officer, like, do you have a clear sense? And I know risk tolerance is a bit of an academic exercise, but it is important, because you want to make sure that, especially the executives might have an idea of what's tolerable, but they communicate that accurately to the board, and is the board on the same page with them? Is
Right.
there alignment there? And if there isn't, it's a problem, because then, when something bad happens, the finger pointing is going to start. And, unfortunately, who ends up suffering is the lower level person who actually was trying to do the right thing to begin with. With the pace, going back to, my opening comments, with the pace of change, the technologies, the shelf life of these technologies is decreasing over time, which creates a situation where you're having the technical debt is accelerating as well, because and if the organization doesn't have the discipline to go back and resolve the technical debt, it could be in actual technology, it could be in the processes, even in the people skill set. If the organization doesn't have enough discipline, you're going to continue to pile on that tech debt over time, and it's happening quicker. And that's essentially raising your risk. You're raising your risk over time significantly. So I think that that's another thing executives and boards need to think about. Like, by not investing in this and by not resolving this, how am I adding on to the accumulated risk of the business? And what is going to happen to us 2 years down the road because we didn't deal with those things? They're not interesting things, like they're just the stuff that's like, why do we have end of life hardware in our environment? Why has this system not been patched in like 2 years? Like, this is not like, why is that server sitting over in that environment? And they found out that, Bob left the company 5 years ago or whatever, 2 years ago, and the server was sitting there. Oh, and nobody even knows about it. Like, because there's a lack of discipline to go back and keep the environment relevant. The analogy, I think the analogy that hit me is that, what person buys a house, like, and it considers that at some point they want it to be a valuable asset in the future, but yet they do not put any improvements into it, they don't do maintenance to it, and like, your value is degrading over time in that home, because you have not decided to invest and keep it up to date and do all the things that you need to do to it. And so this is like a very different example, but like, it helped. Like, I was in a conversation, and it was somebody was talking about real estate, and they were talking about improvements in the real estate and how they do that, how they have a really good, it's part of like overall value of their asset. So why do we not do that with companies? Why do we not have that discipline to continue to improve it and update it, and therefore mitigate our risk, and therefore allow us to be more flexible in the future to do different things? So this is a fundamental problem. And I wonder if it has anything to do with like, hey, I only look on a quarterly basis for financial performance, at least for public companies. So does that promote basically saying, oh, well, I don't have to worry, that's a 3-month thing, it's not gonna but then that 3 months adds up over time, right?
Right. Right. And I think it's also, what do you think, like a culture of cost cutting, right? Like that's the quickest to the bottom line to improve it, just cut costs. And again, that's not really addressing or looking at that holistic picture of how do we make the investment and make the company better, you know?
Cutting costs usually, I mean, the primary driver of, I'll say in a like a software, well, a non-capital intensive business is people. So
Yeah.
cutting costs is really like cutting people. And
It's
the
true.
thing, if you cut costs and you have individuals who are doing, you're cutting people and they're like the ones holding together the processes that are critical because they're doing it themselves manually or otherwise. That's like, do you really understand the impact of cutting that individual to your business?
Yeah. And and again, I think, does it ever get to the level where executives are having that hard conversation of what this really means? Because, they're in a day-to-day, particularly in a maybe an industry that's really struggling with maybe higher interest rates or, whatever, and it's causing fewer widgets to be made or to be able to be made. Um,
But
uh,
there's a cost of being in the business, right? Like
yeah.
you have to decide, am I going to be in this business for the short term, or do I want to be in this business for the long term? And if you're like, if you have the perspective, I'm not going to be in this business a year from now, then absolutely you're going to cut it down. You possibly get it as low cost as you can, because you could, preserve cash and turn around and sell it, because
Right.
that's your goal. But if you're trying to keep something going for an extended period of time, you have to decide to make the investment. You have
Yeah.
to decide to take a different approach to things.
It's true. And I think too, what you brought up earlier about AI, I think that is something that, again, I think we as leaders in the company have to really take time and say, have we created an AI policy? Have we looked into how, and not just saying, I would say the easier thing sometimes is to say no AI. We're not going to use artificial intelligence, right? We're not going to permit it to be used. And yet, I think to your point, it could really help improve some systems or workflows if approached correctly and evaluated correctly, particularly if you're losing people because you're cutting costs, right? How can you leverage the artificial intelligence to help your business processes flow but all of that again takes time sitting down, really thinking and asking questions that maybe, do we have some redundancies because we have too many people doing things that could be done? And then again, it's creating the policy that's comprehensive and making sure that gets done and that everybody's reading it and buying in and getting on board with that. And that all of that is discipline and difficult, I guess, because you can take an off the shelf AI policy, or you can take that answer and say, no, we're not going to use it. But in order to make it work for a company, I think it's really got to be executives across the lines of business saying, how can we put this into our flow and have it help us and minimize any harm or risks by not letting company confidential information be disseminated out of our systems. And there's a lot
Laura,
involved.
I did want to mention something about policies, and I know like compliance people don't like to hear this, but most people in the organization don't pay attention to policies.
Don't tell me
Like,
that.
a lot of them don't even read the policies. And then how you have those like policies where you have to get on the webinar and like you have to see it all the way through before you can
Yes.
check it.
Yes.
People turn it on and walk away. They come back and it's if there's a quiz, they answer the questions. Maybe they don't pass it the first time because they didn't watch anything, but then they pass it the next time. So people have learned how to avoid reading or getting through. Now, not everybody, because there are definitely like that, I'd say anywhere between 10 to 20% of employees who are very policy, like they're gonna read it, they're gonna follow
Right.
it, and then but you've got like a big swath of employees who just don't even pay attention to them. So I wish that something compliance people and would be more it's hard for them to believe that, but it's I don't know how many times I've been in situations where they're, and this goes for our vendors too, like going back to third party risk, we have these contracts set up with vendors, like the questionnaires, how
Yeah.
many vendors lie on those questionnaires?
Yeah.
It's just such a weak assessment of risk. And and let's just say not outwardly lying, but how many vendors truly understand their environment enough to answer those questions in an accurate way? That's not even, willfully like lying. It's just they don't know. They thought, well, according to our policies, we have this, but in reality, if you go check that, they don't have those controls, or they have those controls on a very small subset of their environment, which is important but not comprehensive to what you need in using them as a vendor. So like these are, again, kind of stories we tell ourselves to make us feel better that we have a handle on the risk. In reality, we don't have the handle on the risk. So, and by the way, like there's an aspect of AI that I would say is very, like you mentioned, proactive. We got to go look at it. This is something that's going to build efficiency in our environment. There's an aspect of AI which is going to be a pure survival, which is already Gen AI is being used to derive malware. Gen AI is being used by the attackers to create malware. So we are entering an age where we are going to have AI on our battling AI. I know that sounds, kind of like very futuristic, but we're not that far from it. We're going to have AI systems in our businesses who will deal with AI attacks and generate AI generated like malware. So that's it's a reality that we, instead of our SOC, or people have a security operations center or network operations center, you're going to start seeing increasingly more automation will have to be entered into those environments. If you have an MSSP, this is questions you should be asking your third party who's handling all this. What's your plan for AI and automation? Because they will not be able to keep pace unless they have that functionality in those environments. So it's just this is, again, pervasive change and complexity, and it's happening very quickly for everybody.
You're making me think of Obi-Wan Kenobi and yeah, so the lightsabers that, but it even that is just, as we're talking about, anticipating what's not expected. I mean, that's a great thing that we need as business leaders need to be thinking about, and not just saying, no, our company's not going to do AI, right? Because
if you're taking the approach, no, I'm not going to do AI. Number one, how many of your third-party vendors are already doing AI?
I know. And have we updated our questionnaires to get that response?
And do the people who are filling out the questionnaire even know about how AI is being used? They don't. They probably don't. And
Well,
so,
go ahead. You go.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah, go
I
ahead.
was just gonna say, when you were talking about the questionnaire and the vendor management piece of it, I was like, how many people either answering are not the right level that should be that are exposed to the knowledge to even answer, and then how many people are reading the responses who don't understand, right?
Oh yeah, no, it literally, Laura, I bet you that questionnaire is a checkbox. Okay, did you send the questionnaire to the vendor? Yes. Did the vendor give us a response? Yes. We put that in Archer or whatever system they use, and good. Did anybody read it? Did anybody question? No, you can't, because it's just too much. It's a volume problem.
It's true.
There are just too many, you can't do that kind of exhaustive kind of questioning with these questions. You don't have enough people to do that work. So you essentially you're passing back and forth this questionnaire, maybe electronically, whatever. And it's just like, it's no real inspection of how accurate that occurs is possible because of the volume of work there.
And also think about this, it's chasing to get those responses, because I do know, to get a vendor to respond it's difficult,
Yeah.
uh,
And the large vendors like Microsoft or AWS, they'll just Amazon, they'll be like, "What? We're not answering your questionnaire.
or not.
Like, we're too big. You just have to like accept it." But I in a way I trust them because their entire business is, I mean, if they fail on, ensuring that their systems are solid, that's their core business. They have to make it reliable, they have to make it available, they have to make sure it has good security. And sure, they're not perfect and they're gonna have issues, but they spend, I'd say, a lot of resources to make sure those things are, as maybe not perfect, but as best class as they can be. Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. And I think too, I know that I think that's part of, it's so overwhelming trying to think about how to anticipate the unanticipatable. Again, not really a word, but in as we do our day-to-day jobs, but also layering in, let's, as a company, get to this risk mindset of, let's try not to be reactive, but let's be proactive. Even just you and I having this conversation, I'm just thinking through, oh my gosh, I have a lot that I need to bring forward to the executives, and but it's good, and we should stop and we should take the time to have what you and I are having from a conversational perspective, to just really bounce back and forth about what are some thought processes to enhance the existing, or maybe you haven't had them yet, so while this is
I think one thing you could do is the next time an incident occurs of some type, dive into like say, I want to look at the root cause analysis.
yeah.
Hopefully there is one, because if there isn't one, then that's another problem. But hopefully there is one, and I would really dig deeper on it.
Yeah.
Don't stop at that level that you would have normally stopped. Like go down a few levels deeper and try and understand really what was the root cause. And sometimes I think I've seen that you stop at this root level that doesn't implicate an individual or a process. So like it's safe to say, well, the patch didn't get applied, because then you don't have to go and you're hoping that that's acceptable and no more questions are asked. Well, but then you have to, if you really push it, you dive a little deeper and you find out like, hey, it was an individual or with a lack of process, or which that lack of process could then be reflected upon a leader who was supposed to, ensure that process was there. So I feel like sometimes these root causes stop at a place that doesn't implicate a person. Does that make sense?
Yes. And I think you're probably right.
So because people are going to protect themselves, and they don't want to be a reason that was a problem.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think, yeah, I mean, those are asking the hard questions again, back to what we've been talking about the whole time. Is it a lack of individuals to get the job done, and saying we really do need to spend and invest and get the right people and or tools to keep the company moving forward and improving. I think your analogy was really, really good, particularly because I'm in the mortgage lending space, but no, I think, you do need to one needs to look at it as an investment, and I think sometimes that's not necessarily there.
Yeah, I mean, if you're going to sell the house in 3 months, you probably aren't going to do a lot of improvements on it, right? So,
We had one question that I was going to address, because I think somebody, we had a question about, let's see, determining the proper level of cyber coverage to require of vendors. So I think, that's such a broad question, and in the, like, for each industry and each company has to really take some time and evaluate it. But I do think there's some key pieces that people can think about. And it would be, what's the size of your company? What's the importance of the vendor in terms of interacting with your company? Are you exchanging MPPI? Are you not non-public personal information or HIPAA related? So is personal information being exchanged, and then is the vendor in your environment, or are you sending data to the vendor? And so again, back to kind of what you and I were talking about earlier, is making sure you're digging deep to really understand and ask these broader questions and deeper questions, not surface level of, how big is the vendor, or just looking at maybe a coverage amount, but really understanding nitty gritty details about how at risk is your data, or and then I think to asking the vendor, what are the vendor's baseline controls for cybersecurity? What have they done to protect themselves and their clients? Are they doing multi-factor authentication? What are they doing protecting the ends and outs of the data? And really getting that answer, and not just having it be on a checklist, but reading it and intaking that. And then how much is what are we going to require of the vendor as the company in terms of, do you want SOC 2 reports? Do you want the financials? And then really diving in and reading through those. And then I think another key piece is working with your insurance broker. Once you kind of understood and gotten it down to maybe a few core vendors with whom you're exchanging these critical pieces of information, or are they holding your whole operating system? Or in the mortgage world, it's a loan origination system, right? Where you're keying in the data and stuff for the loans. So, and then working with your insurance broker, there's something called a cyber cube that they can run the data through, and it will spit out based on records and different pieces of data points and information that's entered. It'll aggregate all that data and provide a suggested amount for the cyber coverage. So I think, again, it's knowing your business, knowing your vendor's business and how y'all interact, and then really using your insurance broker to help you solve that, because I'm not the expert at that, right? I'm the expert at kind of making sure we get the coverage all year long, or we renew in time, but utilizing the actual expert there. So that was a long-winded way to get to that question about.
I was going to add a couple of things, Laura. One, just based on experience, really pay attention to the exclusions in these policies. So what they won't cover. And insurance companies are becoming more and more savvy around this topic. They're starting to use more advanced analytics, AI, and other things to really it's a kind of a tough space with all the breaches that are occurring in ransomware. So I think really pay attention to the exclusions because they may say in there they don't cover ransomware. And so you need to know, like, what are you paying millions of dollars for?
Right.
So that's just pay attention to that.
I think that's really good. And I do think the interesting thing, I think, from 5 years ago or 7 years ago to now, because of the ransomwares and the different attacks, I think that to some degree the insurance companies too, probably through the use of AI, but they've been able to, they're understanding the broader picture and able to drive down some of the costs with the law firms doing the research and all the pieces put together. But to your point, another way they're driving down the cost is to create an exclusion. So yeah, well, and as a lawyer would tell everyone to read every bit of their contract and understand what they're signing. So, but that's again from a risk, are you spending do you have the resources able to do that? And are you putting your money
Well,
where your
a lot of companies are like, if I do business with you, you have to have cyber insurance.
yeah,
So that
yeah,
is becoming, one of those questionnaire items that they're
exactly.
actually paying
But
attention.
and even with that though, it goes back to everything we've been saying. Like, so you have a checkbox that says yes, you have it, but do you only have it to $1 million or
Yeah,
one
that's
incident
fair.
that
You
only
gotta
costs
ask.
1 million? And so asking those sub questions and really understanding when it kicks in and how it kicks in, and it becomes a little bit, I think, like with a hurricane, was it floodwaters that came in, or wind and winds, what is it, direct line winds that broke the windows that let the water in, or
Mhm.
which one occurred for which hazard insurance play, the flood insurance or your regular hazard. So
Right.
anyway,
That's
I
an interesting.
shouldn't probably talk about that. And we should say, I hope, everyone's okay from Hurricane Helene hitting, but it does make you think about all those pieces of the insurance world.
Well,
So
I wanted to add to that. I think everybody who should think about that compliance has traditionally been a point in time. There is definitely, annual reviews that look at a period proceeding, but like everybody gears up for the compliance audit. It is kind of this event that occurs, but I think what we really need to do is, we need to build another aspect of the culture, which is continuous compliance. Like at any point in time, somebody could come in and look and see that we are actually compliant. This goes to a lot of the things, like we were brought up that example about patching. If you're truly compliant at every moment around your patching policy, then your risks are going to be a lot less. And the other thing I would just mention too about compliance is, like, not all compliance controls add value. Some of them are like, just like our regulators tend to, lag,
yeah,
in terms of, and some of these compliance controls, I would say, add very little value. And I know this may sound, like, oh, I can't believe she said that, but like I would say minimize your expenditures on controls that don't add value. Truly treat them like a compliance checkbox, because they're not really adding any value, and focus on the compliance controls, which there are a ton of them, that really add value. They really, and so your team, knowing your teams, knowing what to focus, and same thing with your vendors.
yep,
Don't just shoot them a 100-page questionnaire like it, and are all of those questions equally relevant? Maybe
right,
you cut that down to a 1-page questionnaire, and understanding, truly how you're using this vendor and what are the most important things that you need to know about them. So, um, just being more tailored on that.
yeah. I think that those are all great suggestions. And as also the compliance officer, I think I love that continual compliance. That's a great um, mantra to take back to, right? That we're not just looking at that one point in time, but are we continually being a place that, and I think too, as a business partner in the legal compliance risk area, how can I help minimize the risk, but help the business do well, right? Succeed.
Course.
That's got to be part of it. Because if the doors close because we did too much compliance, or we were too constraining, then that doesn't do anybody any good either.
Yeah, no, I mean, I always would tell my teams, who were, large part of my career were security teams. I'm like, look, we have to figure out how to allow the business to do business.
Right.
Because if there is no revenue coming in and it's not growing, we don't have a security team.
Yeah.
Like we exist. I would boil it down to two things. Like one of my companies, I had two very simple goals. Don't We do everything we can to prevent a breach. That's number one. And number two is we enable the business to
Yep.
sell. We enable the business to grow. And so those were their two simple, not very easy, but two very simple goals. Like, let's avoid the breach and let's enable our business to keep moving forward. So
I love that. And I think that's a great way to end this presentation. I guess, Mary Biddle, do we have any questions in the question and answer area?
All right, just coming in. No, we do not have any Q&A coming in, and it's been a great conversation. So thank you both very much for everything.
Well, Vanessa, you've given me tons to take back.
thank you.
So
Yeah,
thank you.
fun having the conversation.
Yep.
Great. Have a great weekend, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, y'all.